Welcome to our FJMC webinar. My name is Norwin Marins, and I'll be your host this evening. And welcome to this special program presented by the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs, FJMC. We are the international umbrella organization for a partnership of more than 200 men's clubs and brotherhoods serving more than 15,000 members throughout North America and beyond. Although we're concentrated in the United States and Canada, the influence of FJMC programs and contributions is felt worldwide. When the COVID pandemic shut down much of the community activity that FJMC was involved in, we initiated these online webinars, and over the past 4 years now have been involved in hundreds of webinars, affinity groups, and other online events engaging thousands of members and non-members in our community. Joining me this evening is my co-chair, Bruce Fagan, who is in Philadelphia. And it's also a great pleasure to have Jonathan Epstein, who is now in his second term as president of FJMC's tri-state region, which encompasses Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Several weeks ago, Jonathan came to us with a wonderful program idea, which is why we're together tonight. And I'm going to pass the baton to Jonathan so he can set the stage for tonight's program.
Norwin, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bruce, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm delighted this evening to be able to introduce my friend, David Mark, a veteran national political reporter, accomplished author, frequent public speaker. I've known David for over 30 years from when I lived in Washington, when we both lived in Washington, D.C. at the start of my own career in journalism. David is a California native, a Brandeis and Columbia Journalism School graduate, and now a resident of D.C. Over his career, he's worked for Congressional Quarterly, Campaigns and Elections, Politico, Politics, CNN, and now the Washington Examiner, where he is managing editor for the Washington Examiner magazine. He's a national political expert who has appeared regularly on TV and radio and has become a sought-after speaker internationally through the U.S. State Department and European Union in over 20 countries. You've probably seen all his full bio in what we sent out. And he's written or co-written 2 books, including Going Dirty, The Art of Negative Campaigning, and Dog Whistles, Walkbacks, and Washington Handshakes, Decoding the Jargon, Slang of Bluster of American Political Speech. And there's no question we've seen a lot of bluster and dirty campaigning from all sides, especially in the last 25 years. So David will have a lot to talk about. Most recently, he was at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, so we'll be able to hear some of his thoughts on that and on the presidential campaign in general. And now I'm proud to present David.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Wonderful to be here. Greetings from North Bethesda, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. Not really thrilled to be part of this. I was an honor to get the invitation. I've always enjoyed visiting Jonathan and the family up in Buffalo, and I think I'd probably see some familiar faces when we go to questions from, I think I was last up there, for Gabe's bar mitzvah, almost going on 2 years ago. But,
probably about right, yeah.
Yeah, whole other discussion. Crazy time in American politics. I'm not sure what being an political expert these days really brings you, because it's so unpredictable. And this is probably about the most unpredictable and unseen presidential race that we've had in some decades, arguably since 1968 or so, when Hubert Humphrey narrowly lost to Richard Nixon through a set of tragic and deeply unexpected circumstances, a bit before my time, some years before that, but I've read a lot about it, and it was, the spirit of that convention was certainly hanging over Chicago over the last week or so, when where the Democratic national convention was held. As Jonathan just mentioned, I was in Chicago for 5 days or so, covering the Democratic National Convention. And these conventions are always an unusual sort of thing, because in one sense, they're very scripted. you know who this, you know what the purpose is there. It's to make the nominee, the presidential and vice presidential nominees look good and to send them on their way to November to win. There's really only one purpose for it. It's not a debating society. It's not to bring up different issues, to ponder where the party should be going and how it should position itself with voters. It's to find the most direct path to winning the November election. So in some ways, it's almost like it's like a show. It's not something that is spontaneous. All the speeches are vetted ahead of time. The organizers know precisely what the speakers are going to say. But in other ways, it's deeply unpredictable, starting in some ways with just the logistics of it. Being on the ground in Chicago, it was wonderful weather there. Nice time to be there. I'm sure many of you have spent time there. Much preferable to some of the winter times, but late August is always a good time to visit. There were an estimated 15,000 accredited journalists there. I'm not sure that all of them showed up. Certainly not all of them went to all of the events and covered in the halls. That's compared to about 5,000 actual delegates who were seated on the ones you see seated on the floor of the convention. And there's not even room nearly for 5,000 people there. So many of the delegates were actually in the first set of seats in the United Center, where the Chicago Bulls and the Chicago Blackhawks play, the basketball, of course, and hockey teams. And that's the part of a convention that's very much unscripted, in that you have people milling about in a very tight area, people you would recognize from television, senators, governors, members of the House, various celebrities, usually somewhat minor celebrities, but people you might have seen on a TV show every now and then are still trying to maintain relevancy. But this one was really interesting in that the participants who got the most favored status, you might say, were not the 15,000 or so accredited journalists, but about 200 credentialed influencers, as they're called, stars of TikTok and other social media platforms. I'm admittedly not a big TikTok watcher and consumer. Many in this audience may be, or perhaps your kids, or more likely grandkids, who are very much on these social media platforms. But many of these influencers were actually given pretty prominent places on the floor of the convention, where they could broadcast and get their message out much more so than older time, more traditional journalists, you might say. And that to me really was reflective of the priorities of at least the Democratic side, where they think influence is coming from. It's not necessarily from big name anchors on CNN or ABC, CBS, et cetera, or print reporters from the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. There were plenty of those folks there, but they and us were kind of relegated to more back tier status, you might say. And the fact that influencers were so much more prominent really suggests that getting messaging out has changed. I'm not saying any of that as a complaint. That's the way it goes, and the nature of communications changes over the years. But it's just something I and many other journalists observed as we were trying to find some spot to watch the convention from up high in the rafters. We could even get up there. Many journalists had effectively what's called a perimeter pass, which is just what it sounds like. It gets you into the security perimeter around the arena, and then an arena pass, which is also just what it sounds like. It gets you into the building itself, into the hallways where they sell concessions, hot dogs, etc., but not actually into any of the seats. There really are no assigned seats other than the delegates themselves. So each convention, it's a matter of just trying to kind of elbow your way in politely but firmly, find a space there. Really, I was fortunate that I was in the hall 3 of the nights, and I was able to either find a seat the first night or kind of stand off inconspicuously into one of the openings and watch the convention there. I wasn't exactly supposed to do that, but one of the volunteers there sort of took pity on me. We became friendly, and she allowed me to stand there as long as I didn't get in the way of any live TV shots. And I was very careful to have to move in and out. I quickly learned to wear tennis shoes with my suit and tie there. Quickly realized it's a political convention, not a fashion show. So it doesn't really matter what kind of shoes you're wearing, as long as they're comfortable. It's a long way of saying that political conventions are really unlike any other type of gathering or anything else we see in American and probably world politics for that matter. And I think the Democrats did a pretty good job. In fact, more than a pretty good job. I'd give them basically an A for getting their message out. As they predicted, the first night was a little bit unruly. It went pretty late. We were there in the convention in the United Center until I think 11:30 p.m., which of course would have been 12:30 a.m. on the West Coast, where, excuse me, on the East Coast, where we all are now. And that's certainly not what the organizers wanted out of the convention. They wanted to be very tightly scripted. President Joe Biden, who's of course not running for re-election, was supposed to speak before, well before 11 p.m., but it didn't end up happening that way. Several speakers got bumped, some members of Congress. The singer-songwriter James Taylor was supposed to perform a tribute to President Biden. There was a Steven Spielberg produced film that was ready to go that also had to get cut because there just wasn't time for it. So things don't always come off as planned, but by the second, third, and fourth nights, things were running pretty smoothly there. And I think Democrats effectively got their message out. I thought Vice President Kamala Harris, the now Democratic nominee, gave an excellent speech. She's not a natural political performer in the way that Barack Obama or former President Bill Clinton are. She has her own style. She's very much like a prosecutor. She once was. She presents a case, and I think that's how she's going to proceed for much of the rest of the campaign. Certainly, once she faces off directly in the planned debate against Donald Trump, the former president and Republican nominee, on September 10th. So I think she got off to a very good start. And my own take on it is, at this point, I think Kamala Harris has a small but persistent lead at this point, looking at the states of the Electoral College. I always thought Democrats had some advantage in this race, even with Joe Biden in the race. Just looking at the popular vote, of course, we all know popular vote is not what decides presidential elections. It's the Electoral College votes and the state-by-state count. But I think it's important to look at the popular vote to see how the states may split up and get divided up. There's about estimated 46% of the population that is always going to be for Donald Trump. It's just ungettable for Kamala Harris. If Joe Biden had stayed in the race, any other Democrat who would have gotten the nomination, it's just unattainable. However, that leaves 53, let's even say 46.5%. So that leaves about 53.5% of the voting public left that is attainable for Kamala Harris, the Democratic ticket. The problem with President Biden remaining there is enthusiasm was so low, was such a desultory ticket. Not a knock against Biden, but obviously his age caught up with him at that debate. It's something that a lot of Democrats have been whispering for some time. Some Democrats and Democratic allies have been saying quite directly, more overtly for a good long time before that. So I think with Kamala Harris on the ticket, she actually has a chance to get to 52, 53% of the popular vote. And in a sense, she almost has to get that high, at least probably to 50, 51%, because the Electoral College is so skewed to the Republicans, meaning Democrats are so clustered in blue states, in New York, where most of you were sitting, in California, the largest state, in Maryland, where I live, in Illinois, in Washington State, a few of these places where the votes are for Republicans are much more dispersed over the swing states in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, New Hampshire and a few other spots, but really those are the main electoral votes, really those 7, not really New Hampshire so much these days. But so Democrats have to come out strong in the popular vote. And I think if you look at the individual state polls, she's in a pretty good place right now. Most of the polling shows her within the margin of error. Either she's up a little bit or Donald Trump's up a little bit in those main swing states that I just mentioned. But that's a lot better than Joe Biden was doing. And just looking at the get out the vote operation, which is what really matters in election day, you look at the campaign field offices, actually those offices on the ground that on election day make sure people get to the polls. Or they, more importantly, these days, they get them to cast ballots early, send them in by mail, whatever it might be. And I just think the Democratic organization is leading. Now, of course, we thought that in 2016, and Donald Trump won that election against Hillary Clinton. So any of these assessments, predictions, if you want to call it that, only go so far. But I just think Harris has some logistical, technical edges. Also, if you look at a bunch of the statewide races, down ticket, particularly the Senate races, Democrats are doing pretty well. Not clear they have enough to hold on to the majority. It's touch and go, I think, based on a Senate race in Montana, and we can get into all this during the question and answer period. But one thing I've noticed that I'm really watching closely that to me is really the touchstone, the indicator of this whole campaign is the state of Nevada, which only has 6 electoral votes. You need 270 to win. So it's not a big prize like one of the larger swing states like Wisconsin, certainly Pennsylvania or Michigan or Arizona. But I think it's pretty indicative. There you have Senator Jackie Rosen. She's finishing up her first 6-year term. She is leading by double digits over her Republican rival. Yet most of the presidential polls only show the race to be neck and neck. And that's something I just simply don't believe. I don't think there's going to be that much of a split between the Senate and the other races and the presidential races. In recent years, we've seen almost no ticket splitting. It used to be reasonably common, never the majority of the times, but there were plenty of times where states would vote for one party's presidential candidate and the Senate nominee of another party. It actually kind of peaked back in 1972, the year that Richard Nixon won a 49-state landslide over George McGovern. That same year, a 29-year-old Democratic Senate candidate in Delaware, Joe Biden, also won and beat a Republican incumbent. So it used to happen with some frequency. It almost never happens these days. For the first time in Senate election history in 2016, there were no splits between the presidential race vote and Senate vote. In 2020, there was one where Susan Collins of Maine, a Republican, won another term, while Joe Biden was winning the majority of the state's electoral votes. They split their electoral votes. That's a whole other tangent that we can go down if we want to during the question and answer the discussion section. But there's just not that many votes. And I just don't believe that Kamala Harris is down that much in Nevada when you have Senator Jackie Rosen leading. She was kind of a fascinating figure to me. She came into politics reasonably late. She was a computer programmer for part of her career. And I might add, a synagogue president in Henderson, Nevada, a suburb of Las Vegas. I think the only one to ever serve in Congress. I'd have to check on that. There have been other Jewish members who have been active in their synagogues, but I think she's the only one who actually was a president in the House and Senate, for whatever that's worth. So she got a taste of politics before coming to Washington. Some probably even more severe and more intense in some ways. But again, a whole other discussion to be had. Anyway, just watching her campaign, the fact she's up so much, I'm skeptical. Also looking at diving into some of the polling data, the crosstabs as they're called, which I always find the most interesting because it kind of tell you what people are really thinking, not just the top lines as they're called, who's up, who's down, but looking how the vote is split at the are estimated to be split between men and women and age groups and income distribution and all kinds of other ways of slicing and dicing it. And most of the polls there have shown Clark County, which is where the Las Vegas Strip is located, to be evenly split. And that's something I just simply don't believe, because I know how politics is done in Nevada. The Democratic machine is expert on election day going up and down the Strip to casino workers, those in the kitchens, those who clean hotels, basically service workers, and turning them out on election day. They have an excellent record of this, and there's no reason to think it's gone any differently. So I'm kind of looking at Nevada as the one state that to me is an indication of how I think the national vote may go. Having said that, lots can change. We're, I think, 69 days out from the election at this point, and anything can happen. But I still would give Kamala Harris just a bit of an edge there, maybe even more than a little of an edge at this point. I'm not much of a betting man myself, but if you had to put down a little money, I would actually give her a bit better odds than Donald Trump. Just a couple other things I want to mention, because I definitely want to open up to discussion. One thing that also I noticed did not happen much at the Democratic convention. There wasn't a lot of dissent over Israel and the Gaza war, Israel's defensive war against Hamas, now Hezbollah, in Lebanon, etc. There were, surprisingly, nobody in the arena was really able to put up any kind of protest. I think there was a lot of concerns that these uncommitted delegates, which voted pretty large during the primaries in Minnesota, Michigan, a few other states, they really, like, we're talking into the six figures, more than 100,000 people in a primary of a few million. That's a size of a couple million. That's a sizable showing in these states, but they weren't very loud. Even the protests outside by anti-Israel protesters, I call them, at least, because I don't think they're particularly pro-Palestinian. Again, another discussion to be had, but they kind of fell back. There were some of them out there. If anything, I thought the climate change protesters were louder than a lot of the anti-Israel protesters. And I wasn't really there on the protest beat most of the time. I was just trying to get into the arena and out, which was enough of a hassle with all the security. So I didn't really observe it too closely. But one thing I did notice is they seem to be realists. These virulently anti-Israel folks don't really seem to want Donald Trump to win. And that's the logical outcome of protesting too hard against Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, in that you're basically saying they're not going to vote for Trump, if they're just not going to vote at all, that's kind of half a vote for Trump, logically. And they seem to have realized that that's just not the way to go, that if they want their cause embraced at all, they're probably going to get no hearing in the Trump administration, at least in the way they want to. Trump may not be pro-Israel in a lot of the ways that we'd like to think, but it's not out of sympathy for these protesters and their stated cause. So that was one thing that actually surprised me as well. Just one other thing that I'm mentioned before was this debate coming up on September 10th. And debates, of course, are expectations games. It's about spin before the debate, where you have both sides trying to talk up the debating skills of the opposition. I'll be fascinated to see how Kamala Harris approaches Trump. I imagine during debate preparation, she's being warned about how he may get into her physical space, the way he kind of loomed over Hillary Clinton back in 2016, if you remember that debate. Again, she was a renowned prosecutor in the earlier part of her career. She later became district attorney of San Francisco. She actually started her career across the East Bay in Alameda County, where Oakland and Berkeley are based, and some other communities. And she had a tremendous track record there for putting away criminals, and a real way with her of speaking before juries. And she had a very strong conviction rate. And you talk to people who worked in that office today, whatever their politics, and they still speak very highly of her. The career prosecutors who are still there. I know some folks in the community who are career prosecutor, at least a couple of people who've worked in that office for many years, and they speak very highly of her. So I'll be fascinated to see how she kind of carries herself. I think she's going to have to do some kind of television interview or at least radio interview, something from the media. As a journalist, strongly believe that she should be answering questions. I'm not terribly surprised she isn't. That's sort of the way these things go these days, but I think the pressure is going to be so great, if for no other reason, that the more time that goes without her granting an interview to a mainstream news organization, the more the expectations are going to build up. And so when she finally does give an interview, there's going to be breathless coverage of it. Whereas if she just talked to journalists on a regular basis, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. So I think they're getting there. I have some sympathy and understanding for just wanting to get through the convention. But now it seems like they're just trying to run out the clock effectively. And she can probably predict a lot of the questions that are going to be asked, not just on her changes of positions on some issues like fracking in Pennsylvania, oil drilling, et cetera, but all Medicare for all, doing away with private health insurance, but also as she advocated back in her 2020 presidential bid, but also about outgoing President Joe Biden himself. Like how long did she know that he wasn't in great physical condition to be able to run for president again? Why did she defend him so strongly the night of the debate when the whole world saw how poorly he performed? She'll have to answer those questions. I presume she's got answers ready. And I think she's actually really improved just in her public persona in terms of answering interview questions in her 3.5 years as vice president. So I think those are a couple of things to watch. And with that, so much more to discuss. But we've got so many people here. I would love to throw it open to the audience and start the discussion.
Okay, well, there's a number of questions that have been posed in the about the chat and the Q&A. But first, if I may, I've got one or two questions to kind of kick it off. What did you think of the choice of Tim Walz over Josh Shapiro?
Tim Walz has grown on me. I was never particularly against him. I remember I thought it was the reason I was a little bit skeptical at first, because I remember covering him in Congress. He came in the class of 2006, which was part of the Democratic class that ended the Republican majority that had been in place for a dozen years, a long time. He beat a sitting Republican congressman at that point from a southern Minnesota district. Basically, it straddles the entire state line with Iowa. So it's really, Midwestern, much more classic Midwestern than the Twin Cities, which is a liberal big city, et cetera. He was much more conservative, or at least centrist moderate, once he became governor of Minnesota, and particularly after Democrats got the entire control of state government, he went pretty hard left, and he became a big advocate on raising taxes, on some issues relating to trans high school students. I'm not getting to the merits of that, whether those ideas are good or bad, but it seemed like it was pretty easy to paint him as far left. So I was skeptical of not choosing Josh Shapiro at first. I admit I was concerned that the reason that Kamala Harris did not choose Governor Shapiro was because he's an Israel supporter, but they're all Israel supporters. Everybody she was choosing, their positions are basically indistinguishable. So what's the other obvious variable in there? He's Jewish, with an obviously Jewish name, et cetera, and that she succumbed to pressure there. But from what the reporting that I saw and heard, it seemed like she didn't have a great interview, or Josh Shapiro, I should say, did not have a great interview with her. Actually, she's the boss. She's the one making the choice. And I don't have to tell, I think Jonathan may have covered Josh Shapiro some years back in college. He's a very ambitious guy. I first heard about him 20 years ago. Time flies, when he was first elected to the state house in Pennsylvania, somebody who had grown up with him in suburban Philadelphia, my old boss, as a matter of fact, who knew him and gone to, I think it's Akiba, now called Akiba Academy in suburban Philadelphia, and spoke very highly of him, but also noted how politically ambitious he was. And I can see not wanting somebody of that nature on the ticket. Tim Walz is probably closer to the end of his political career than even the middle, like Josh Shapiro is. He's already been governor for 6 out of 8 years. Actually, there are no term limits for governors in Minnesota, so he could run again. But realistically, they tend to serve to be in office 8 years or so. Josh Shapiro only got there, he was only elected in 2022. So time will tell. I at this point, I think it's a pretty good pick. If Kamala Harris ends up losing Pennsylvania by like 3,000 votes, and it's the deciding state in the race, it may not look so good. But overall, I think it's a pretty strong pick. And I think Tim Walz has certainly acquitted himself very strongly on the campaign trail. He's got a real different style than Josh Shapiro, who's more like a Barack Obama speaker. He even kind of sounds like him with his cadences. Waltz is more a folksy guy. He's more of a backslapper, come up. We could talk to just about anybody. I'm sure Josh Shapiro is good about that, but he always struck me as a little bit more stiff and formal. Somebody who's basically been planning a political career his whole adult life and even before that, whereas I don't think that's the case with Tim Walz. So on the whole, I think pretty strong at this point.
Okay. Yeah, he was at University of Rochester at the same time that I was, and he was the student senate president when he was a sophomore. And I
Wow.
did the paper. That's when I covered him. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it. We'll get
Yeah.
stories about that some other time.
What did you think of Kamala Harris's comments on Israel and Gaza in her speech?
I thought they were fine. It's not what I'd like to personally hear. Don't usually give my own opinions as a journalist, but I will here. Not exactly my personal preference, but I thought it was what any Democratic presidential candidate said. And most importantly, again, it was what she did not say. I was pleased she did not cave in to the protesters, those who wanted a speaking slot to try and denounce Israel, etc. So I thought they were just fine and pretty good. Which really comes down to it. She really left no daylight there, and my sense is she actually is a real supporter of Israel. Maybe not in the way that some of us would hope for or choose, but I do think. Remember, she's been sitting in the highest level security meetings, national security meetings, for 3.5 years now. She sees the intelligence. She knows what's going on behind the scenes after October 7th. And she made a few errant remarks here and there that might lead some Israel supporters to be a little concerned. But everything that I know about her, including her record in the Senate and people who have known her throughout her career, I think I'm comfortable that she's staunchly pro-Israel, if maybe not emphatically pro-Israel, but staunchly. It's maybe one step down from that, and probably about as good as you're going to get these days.
All right, a few questions from some of our listeners. Your assessment of the underperformance of Democrats by 3% in 2016 and 2020, in the close polls, 1.5%. Not sure what the question was there, but betting odds are also favoring Trump. What is the future for Israel support if Harris or Trump wins?
If Harris wins, I think it would be, I imagine the approach to Israel would be fairly comparable to Joe Biden. She's probably not going to give the same rhetorical kind of support. Joe Biden comes from an earlier era. I'm not trying to sound ageist or anything, but he saw Israel in its early years. Remember, he was elected to the Senate. He entered at age 30. He was elected at age 29. He talks frequently about his first visit there being in 1973, even in the months before the Yom Kippur War, where he met Golda Meir, and he's known every Israeli leader, and he really feels that in his guts. I truly believe he's a real supporter. Again, I do think that Kamala Harris is too. She seems to have indicated that she would actually meet with folks who want to stop arms sales to Israel and basically otherwise be much more hostile to it. I actually don't necessarily have a problem with her meeting with a group like that. It's what she would say during that meeting. And I have no reason to think that she would actually turn her back on Israel or anything like that. So I personally tend to think it's more rhetorical. We'll never know till she gets into office. Trump, of course, does have a track record. He moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, which is something that presidents of both parties were supposed to do under the 1996 law, but never did. I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. The shepherded in the Abraham Accords during his presidency. But there's another side to it. His quote unquote realist foreign policy doesn't leave much room for international alliances. And usually in those kind of situations, Israel can end up getting the short end of the stick. And I have no, I have no reason to think he wouldn't just change his mind if he needed to when it comes to Israel. And that's just my gut feeling, just surmising it. I can only go off what he actually did in office, which I think is very praiseworthy. I'm a big believer in giving credit where credit is due. So even if I have some issues with him on lots of other matters, I thought he was excellent on that issue. But I also think that could change in the second term. So I don't have the faith in him on Israel that a lot of other people do who are consider themselves to be pro-Israel.
Can you assess the impact of the Kennedy endorsement?
I'm skeptical it's going to have that much influence. If anything, it sort of helps the Democrats because it brings their opponents out to the open. Now we don't have to guess how much support Kennedy might or might not get in swing states. How much you don't have to devote a lot of polling to it or anything like that. He's just on Trump's side, and you could model your polling, your turnout efforts, all your campaign logistics to factor in him being on Trump's side. How many people? I'll be curious to see what the polling shows in the coming days. How many people are really ardent Robert F. Kennedy Jr. fans? How many of them are true MAGA folks? How much of an overlay there is on a kind of Venn diagram? I tend to think there's relatively little in that. Even if Robert F. Kennedy gets his way and he forces Donald Trump to start talking about the perils of COVID-19 and other vaccines, I think that does not help Donald Trump in the suburbs where he really needs support, in the suburbs of Philadelphia and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Detroit and Phoenix, Arizona, et cetera. So I think the louder RFK Jr. is, the more it potentially hurts Trump. So, having said all that, the difference in a lot of states, percentage-wise in 2020 is smaller than the levels of support percentage-wise that RFK Jr. is getting in the polls. So he certainly can't be discounted, but I just don't think he's going to be that much of a factor.
Do you think that Harris's attempts to placate the progressive wing of her party may turn off more moderate, uncommitted voters?
I think if anything, she actually has gone the other direction, at least in her acceptance speech the other night. When she ran in 2020, I think she got, for the Democratic nomination, I think she got some bad advice from her consultants and her family who were basically running the campaign. The mood at the time seemed to be go hard left. This was in the time of, actually, this was before the George Floyd episode and the riots that ensued and all that. But already the party was going in that really woke direction. And that's where it seemed like you needed to be to win the nomination. She's really moved away from a lot of that. So rhetorically, at least, I think she's actually moved back toward the center. And I'd say if you're a Democrat or even anybody who wants her to win, whether you're a Democrat or not, I think there's a lot to be pleased about in that she seems to understand the goal of all this, which is to not go too far left, to show you're a reasonable centrist person. Hey, you might disagree on some issue here or there, but you're not some far out lefty the way that she's being portrayed as. So I think she's actually moved kind of more toward the center, at least with her campaign trail rhetoric. We'll see. We already can see what Trump is trying to do by calling her a socialist, a communist, long-standing tactics. I'm skeptical that's going to work, but we'll see over the next 2.5 months.
What is the chance that local Republican election officials in key swing states will be able to prevent certification of results like in Maricopa County?
That's a great question and a scary one, in that I think Kamala Harris, as mentioned, is in a decent, certainly not overwhelming, but in a decent position to win the Electoral College. But it's pretty clear to me the Republican tactic and strategy seems to be to prevent certification in key swing states if it's close enough and try to throw it into the House of Representatives. All I can say is Democrats have a huge legal team in place, or they're putting one together in all these states to fight that. A lot of these state laws may not be legal under federal law, and I know Trump has appointed many of the judges, but if we saw anything from the post-election day time period in 2020, judges sided with against Trump, not even with Biden so much, but against Trump almost unanimously every step of the way in, I think, 60 out of 61 cases. So I guess I just have to have some faith that the courts will uphold some of this. It's worth part of it depends on who actually wins control of both the House and Senate, particularly the House. I think the Democrats have a decent shot at getting the House, probably even better, a little bit better than that. I think they might be favored at this point. If they're in control on January 6, 2025, obviously they have a lot of say in it. And remember who's going to be presiding in the chair ultimately as vice president. It will still be Kamala Harris, whether she's the president-elect or the designated president-elect or the losing candidate in the 2024 campaign, even though some of the rules have been changed to prevent shenanigans like Donald Trump wanted Mike Pence to engage in. I think Democrats still have structural advantages there, but it's something that has to be watched. Arizona was mentioned there. That's one to be concerned about. I'm as concerned actually about Georgia, where there's a new state law in place that gives local election boards, and there's like 259 counties in Georgia, the second most only to Texas. And if even one objects, it can gum up the works and at least delay certification. And that can happen. There's many of those counties are deep red, like in Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's district in the northeast section of the state near the South Carolina state line, or in the southern section where straddling the Florida state line. Those counties are some of the reddest in the nation, and you could only imagine, and they're pretty sparsely populated too. You could only imagine some of the shenanigans that they might try and instigate there. So we'll see. But I guess I would say I'm cautiously optimistic that the courts will perform their duties there.
The question from before restated, the presidential election polls were off in 2016 and 2020 by 3%. Polls are currently very close at 1.5%, favoring Harris. Swing states are even closer, but betting odds are also favoring Trump. Any thoughts on the polls and what that all means?
I think polls become actually less accurate each election cycle, which is good or bad depending on your perspective, which also means it could be underestimating Kamala Harris in some ways. It's just harder and increasingly difficult to get a representative sample these days because a lot of people don't even have landlines anymore. People use their cell phones. It's hard to get a response. It's hard to weight it for who's actually going to turn out on election day. That is where it has favored Trump the last two presidential elections, where it undercounted those who actually came out and supported Trump. But I think pollsters have found better ways to at least try to account for some of that. Also in 2022, in the midterms, the polls, if anything, underestimated Democratic chances, and same to a degree in the off-year elections in 2018. So I think if anything, the polls may be undercounting Harris's support in some of these places up. We will see. I think it's just a good lesson not to put too much weight into polls. And even political consultants, those who run campaigns, will always remind you emphatically, polls are a snapshot in time. They are not predictive. And this is something that political journalists in particular have a hard time deal with. Polls can't tell us what we want them to tell us. We want them to be able to tell us who's going to win, and they simply can't do that with any sort of accuracy. They can show a snapshot, prediction in time, like a photo from your iPhone. What shows 69 days out where we are now could change a lot. What shows even 3 days out could change a lot. So I don't put too much faith in any single poll. You have to average them out. One other element there to be wary of, and I don't mean to be too bullish in the Democratic chances because it is neck and neck and it could go either way. But something that's happened the last couple of election cycles with polls is Republican operatives have gotten very good at flooding the zone with Republican leaning polls that show Republicans doing much better than it ultimately would be, with the goal of weighting the averages to make it look like the average of these polls is much more in Republican favor. This happened a lot in 2022, to a degree in 2020, which is, again, I'm not saying Harris absolutely is going to win, and I think it's pretty close, but I still think for the reasons I mentioned, she has an advantage, but we will see.
What happens if Harris is declared the winner and Trump won't concede?
Well, technically, there's no law saying there has to be a concession. Trump never conceded in 2020, and Joe Biden still became president. I think what really matters is what legal steps would be taken in these various swing states, or not just legal, but potentially political steps. And I have some worry about that, but less than 2020. Maybe that's being naive, but part of the reason is these swing states have at least they're not completely controlled by Republicans anymore. In Pennsylvania, there already was a Democratic governor, but now the state house is controlled by Democrats. So it's not like the state legislature there could try and send an alternate, quote unquote, set of electors, or phony set of electors. That's really what happened. In Michigan, Democrats now have unified control of government, the governorship and the state house. In Arizona, it's touch and go. The Republicans have majorities in the legislature by the narrowest margins, and that's very competitive in this fall. There is also a Democratic governor, Democratic Secretary of State. In Nevada, there's a Democratic legislature. So I'm less concerned. And in Wisconsin, after redistricting was ordered by the state Supreme Court, Democrats have a chance of winning the state assembly. So I'm not saying Republicans couldn't still try to instigate games. And maybe this is kind of like fighting the last war, closing the barn door after the animal is out. Pick your cliche. I'm sure they've got some kind of new and imaginative ways to try and mess with the election results. But just based on that, I think, and for a variety of other reasons, I think it's going to be somewhat more difficult to employ those kind of tactics. Also, the fact that Trump lost 60 court cases, and there's just a lot, including some Supreme Court rulings, there's just a lot more case law to direct the courts in some of these issues now.
Should Trump win, what are your thoughts about Project 2025 and how he'll use it?
I think there's every reason to believe that would come to fruition, at least major parts of it. I don't care what Trump is saying now. He's kind of backtracking on some of the abortion provisions. And of course, he's saying, I'll have nothing to do with it. I don't actually think Donald Trump himself wants to be a dictator, or that he wants to implement certain policy issues, like basically banning abortion nationwide, implementing the Comstock Act, this 19th century law that would prevent birth control from being sent from the mail. I don't actually think Donald Trump wants to do that, but I think several people who could enter his administration do, and he'd probably just give them free rein and let them go as they operate as they see fit. So I don't know that all of it would come to pass, but yeah, I'm a big believer. If somebody, you know, as the saying goes, somebody tells you how they're going to act, believe it, even if he's trying to run away from it now. Not the first time presidential administrations have taken outside advice. Actually, the Reagan Revolution, when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated in 1981, and the months and years after that, a lot of the planning and the personnel logistics came from the same Heritage Foundation. It was very different back then. They proposed a lot of the people who got into not just cabinet roles, but the really ones that matter: sub deputy secretaries, assistant deputies, people with all these fancy titles who really implement, who are part of the bureaucracy. And I don't mean that in a negative way, because I'm a big believer in government service, the ones who actually implement government policy. And that came from the Heritage Foundation. It's happened in other administrations. So if Trump wins, be 2025, Project 2025 is not just going to be a name, it's going to be a real lived reality.
Got a couple other questions on polling here. The poll machine seems to have grown over the decades. A philosophical question: is all this polling beneficial to the general electorate and our democratic processes or not? And the other is Republican pollster Frank Luntz seems worried about Trump's chances. Is that meaningful?
I start with Luntz. I think it is meaningful because he's usually pretty bullish on Republican chances and talks him up like that. He's a Republican pollster. More than other people who are partisan affiliated usually tout their own sides. If he's talking about chances, I think Luntz has noted specifically the drop off, the increased support with white working class males that Kamala Harris seems to be getting. It maybe a little bit. Also, one other facet that I think that Frank Luntz has mentioned is it seems like support is declining for Trump by Black men, which is an area that a group that the Trump campaign has targeted heavily in a bunch of ways. That seems to be reverting to mean, coming back down to earth. So I think Luntz is onto something there. He's kind of a mixed bag. I actually saw him on the floor of the convention. I'm not quite sure what he was doing there. I'm sure it's hard to take a scientific poll there. You could say the same thing about me or any other journalist wandering around. I think he likes to be the center of attention there, but it is notable to me that he's changed his tune. As far as so much polling going on, I think it probably is somewhat unhealthy to have so many polls out there, but I think it also is forcing people to average them out, as I mentioned earlier, and not take any one too seriously. I think it really depends. It's more about the campaigns than anything else and how they use polls. Polling is used correctly to when you already know what you think. You know what your principles are, your message that you want, your ideas that you want to convey. And polling can help you refine that to know how to better target the public, but it means you're not going to back down from your main principles that you already have. Where polling is used in a way that's not civically, a way that's helpful civically, is in a civic manner, is where you use polls to tell you what to think and just stick your finger in the wind and go whichever way it wants. And it doesn't usually end up working very well either. So it's really up to the candidate, the campaigns, and the candidates, in my view, to use polls in an effective way that conveys the principles, and that they should have strong principles that they won't deviate from.
All right, we've got a couple other questions. We're coming up on an hour now, but we've got still more questions coming in. So, David, if it's okay with you to keep going for a little bit.
Absolutely.
So we'll try to give it another 5-10 minutes and see if people have other questions. If Trump wins, how would he get the American hostages out of Gaza, and for that matter, all the hostages?
Well, he said he would do it in a day, just like he would broker peace in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine. He has no better idea than any of the rest. You have the top minds doing it. I've been quite pessimistic, tragically, about the hostage situation from the early hours of after the October 7th attacks, because I just don't see what incentive ultimately Hamas has to release them. It just pains me to even say that out loud. No Israeli leader, whether it's Benjamin Netanyahu or anybody else who might be prime minister, could come to the kind of deal that Hamas is asking for, and a lot of the world is pressuring them to do, which is basically to agree to a permanent ceasefire with no military presence in Gaza, among other things. There's no way any Israeli leader could agree to that. So minds smarter than me are working at this hard, negotiating, but Trump has no better idea how he would do it. He says that Hamas and other foes of Israel would be so scared of him that they would automatically, just like the way that the Iranian hostages were released after Jimmy Carter left office and Ronald Reagan came in. There's a lot of myths to that. It didn't exactly, I mean, it technically happened that way, but it wasn't necessarily because they were scared of Reagan. It's because they were tired of Jimmy Carter. They want to humiliate Jimmy Carter and the Ayatollahs by that had consolidated their political sport, and they didn't really need the hostages anymore. Different kind of situation. Whenever I've heard Trump use that analogy a couple of times, so I'd be even more pessimistic about that situation, tragically, than where we stand now. I'm afraid to say.
So yeah, I know you were not at the Republican convention, but what's your sense of the Republican strategy and what they're trying to do, at this point, especially now that Harris is the target? Are they going to go personal? Are they going to go on attack mode in other ways? What do you foresee?
Well, absolutely go personal. Trump already started with that statement that he only recently realized she was black or whatever. She's half Indian and of Indian descent. I'm not phrasing it correctly, but it's so ridiculous and hateful and insulting that I'm sure everybody on this call got the gist of that. So that's a start of it. I think it's going to go much more ugly. I think the Trump campaign is concerned right now. The fact that they are advertising heavily in North Carolina, which is an interesting state on paper. It's one that should be more competitive. Democrats thought they really had a chance of turning it after 2008 when Barack Obama won it narrowly, but it's then reverted to mean it's gone back to being Republican. And that turned out to be the only time Democrats have won North Carolina since 2008. I'm sorry, since 1980 was in 2008. So most of the time it's been going Republican. And the fact that the Trump campaign is advertising so heavily there makes me think they have internal poll numbers. Then the other day, Trump tried to make nice with the Georgia governor, Republican Brian Kemp, after insulting the governor and his wife, which is about as low as it gets. This was in ancient history. This is like 2 or 3 weeks ago that he put something up on Truth Social about the governor and the first lady of Georgia. So they must, I can only imagine they have internal polling suggesting those states are real trouble spots for them. So I think they're going to be playing defense as much as possible. And I'll be fascinated to see how much, if at all, and if so, how much the Harris-Walz ticket really plays in North Carolina. If they could get that, I think there's 16 electoral votes in North Carolina. They can make it almost impossible for the Trump campaign to win. One other place that I'm watching that the Trump campaign may have to play defense, this is really getting into the weeds, but in the first congressional district of Maine, which is this big, huge, sprawling district in northern Maine, going way up to the Canadian border. Maine is one of only 2 states that splits its electoral votes, along with Nebraska. Trump won that district in 2016 and 2020. I saw a poll of Maine the other day showing it evenly split between Harris and Trump. So if that one is reverting back to the Democratic side, it's another reason I think things are going more even in Harris's direction, even though I know what all the polls say in the betting markets, et cetera, still show, which are reliable to a point, but not nearly as good as they're sometimes made out to be.
Any projections on the swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Georgia, and any projection overall?
My overall projection, I would give, again, Vice President Harris a small, but I'd say pretty solid chance of winning. And when it, to me, grows a little bit each day, obviously that can change at any time. We're 69 days out. So many things can happen. But based on everything we know now, I think Michigan is looking pretty good for the Democrats based on what I've seen. Even Wisconsin seems to be going in their favor. Pennsylvania is just touch and go. You could argue that one either way. There are, in some ways, it's becoming more friendly to Republican type candidates because it's more rural and areas like that. Voter registration has grown somewhat in Republicans' favor, but Democrats could also argue that they are getting some of the more suburban areas. That one is touch and go. I think ultimately it will go in the Democratic direction. My guess is that's one of the reasons that she did not choose Josh Shapiro, the governor, as her running mate, is they felt comfortable enough. In Pennsylvania, they had polling showing that. That's just a guess on my part. I don't have any inside information. I think Georgia is one to watch. I was not terribly surprised that one went for Joe Biden in 2020. I think the demographics are moving more in the Democrats' direction. Georgia's an interesting mix. It's I think about 33% Black. And then you have, so that's a big Democratic base there. Then you have a lot of professional class voters from all these big companies that are based down there, not just companies, but employers, you might say white collar employers, Delta Airlines, the Centers for Disease Control, Emory University, DHS, Coca-Cola, et cetera. And they're attracting people from Harvard Business School and all the top law schools and business schools and other professional programs. And, those people generally vote more Democratic, and I think it's going more in that direction. Whether that's enough to offset the rural vote and the still strong Republican vote down there, that's the real question in Georgia. But they keep adding more people, every day. When I was last in Atlanta, I just saw these huge apartment complexes going up. And if even a decent fraction of those people are registered to vote, that's going to work in Democrats' favor. Arizona, I think, is one also that's moving. I think that one's going to be a purple state and eventually a Democratic state in the next 10 to 15 years or not. We'll see what happens for this fall. But for the Latino vote, for similar reasons, some professional workers, other just snowbirds moving down from the Northeast that used to go to Florida. A lot of them like the dry heat of the desert for other reasons. They're going down more that direction. So my prediction right now would be pretty close, if not exactly the same, that Joe Biden won in 2020, 306 electoral votes to, I think it's 272 for Donald Trump. But, feel free to email me or contact me in a month, and I might have a very different view of it.
Last question from the group, and then a quick one that I thought I'd throw in. If Harris wins and Trump won't concede, do you think we could see a repeat, something even bigger and worse even than January 6th?
Sure. It brings me no pleasure to say that. I don't think it would necessarily be at the Capitol. I'd like to think security has been enhanced, and it really does seem to have been there. So I don't think you would see that same kind of attack. See it on state capitals. I wouldn't even want to give out ideas in public. These people with bad intention can think of their ideas enough on their own. But I'm very concerned about violence if we saw it on January 6th. That's why I hope it's a blowout one way or the other. It's not close. Democrats are not going to contest it that way, instigate violence. If the Democrats win, I just hope it's by a wide margin, not because I'm a partisan Democrat, just for that reason. But yeah, I'm very concerned about it.
Okay, and finally, a question that I think a lot of people on this call will appreciate a little bit. You had mentioned earlier the one senator, I think it was it? I'm trying to remember if it was from California, who also had been a synagogue president.
Senator Jackie Rosen of Nevada.
Nevada, yeah. So I guess the question is, what's harder, a Senate district or a synagogue?
It's interesting. I remember, actually, Jonathan, you appreciate this. There's a big congregation in Washington, D.C., Adas Israel, which is the big political place. It's actually the kind of unofficial synagogue of Israel's ambassador to the to the United States. I should say they go there on high holidays. It's a tradition going back to the 60s. I think they're given, if not free membership, honorary membership, whatever. You see Supreme Court justices there on the high holidays. You see others there. Some members of Congress there go there regularly for services. Former Congressman Henry Waxman of California, I saw him there one time, and he said something to the effect of synagogue politics are more complicated, more cutthroat than Capitol Hill. So to me, that answers the question.
All right, great. Thank you, David, for taking all this time, for giving us some terrific insights. We all appreciate it, and look forward to hearing from you again, and to sharing some more wings up in Buffalo sometime.
Absolutely. We'll have to make that happen. I look forward to it.
Sounds good.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Norwin, do you want to take it up?
Okay. Thank you to both David and Jonathan for an outstanding presentation. Your analysis, David, is very insightful, and for Jonathan, this is like another day in the office with your outstanding journalistic approach and the communications that was conveyed this evening. If you have input, the audience listening this evening has input on future programs, certainly let us know. Any information on the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs is available through fjmc.org. And on behalf of Bruce Fagan, myself, and those participating this evening, both David Mark and Jonathan Epstein, we wish you a good evening and stay tuned for future programs sponsored by the FJMC. Have a good evening.